Alright, this is take 4. Takes 1 and 2, I had a webcam involved, and for some reason the webcam just broke the file. Take 3, I made it all the way through to the very end and then realized my mic was muted. And now here I am for take 4. It's going to be the last one. And it's my presentation on Grace Hopper. Now she was a mathematician first, computer scientist and programmer second, which might be out of the scope of engineering a little bit, but computer science is within the School of Engineering at UConn, so I'm counting her as an engineer for the sake of this presentation. And I chose Grace Hopper because she is a legend and an icon in computer science history, but also because women as a underrepresented group in computer science, I mean only 15% of people with comp sci degrees are women nowadays, so definitely underrepresented. Um, they they have a surprising history. So to quickly, this is a little bit of an aside from Hopper, but I believe it relevant. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a huge demand for computational manpower, or or should I say woman power, and I'll list the 2 reasons why. Now, obviously the human race found a lot of reasons why to compute, or else we would have never invented the computer. But one of those things that required a lot of hours simply structuring data was the census, which by the Constitution was supposed to happen every 10 years. Now, due to the population boom in the mid 1800s and the immigration boom in the 1880s, it reached a point where it would take over a decade to complete a census, which was supposed to be performed every decade. So obviously wasn't something working out there. Now, another thing was for the artillery, the method of taking an initial guess and then simply adjusting that initial guess was no longer good enough because artillery could and would fire at targets miles away. So these ballistic tables became a thing, which were books of pages on pages on pages of how to aim the artillery given wind conditions, target distance, sea conditions, atmospheric pressure, whatever. There were many variables to control, so there had to be many rows and many columns to these tables, and that's a lot of computation for a world without computers. Except there were computers, and the women were computers, and it was a job title instead of electronic device. Women were computers for 2 main reasons. The job was in higher demand during war times, just like because more artillery shooting things, and more ballistic tables and logistical stuff to calculate, and also uh, men wouldn't be around to do it during wartime. And even if men were there, the men wouldn't really want to do it. So after World War I and the men came back, women were allowed to keep their jobs working as computers, even though there were some other jobs like aerospace engineering, where women were immediately fired upon the completion of the war. So women would sit in big rooms at the beginning of the day. They'd be told in English what operations needed to be performed, and it was their job to translate that English into punch cards. And there would be a card with like boxes, and depending on the operation or the order of the operations, holes would be punched into it differently, and then fed into a machine, a calculator-like machine, and it could take sometimes hours, days to get a team of women to perform some more complicated computations. By the 1940s, there was even a unit to describe how complicated a computation would be, and it was the girl hour or the kilo girl hour, which respectively referred to an hour or 1,000 hours of computational work. Now, due to how like women, due to how closely they worked to computation in computer science, there was less of a stigma around them being in computer science, which of course that's a relative term. But just think, like, there were tons of women on the floor doing the dirty work, and if one of them got a promotion, all of a sudden there'd be a female authority figure in comp sci, and it kind of set the stage. Now, Hopper's early life, uh, Hopper was raised by parents that believed women should be treated equally as men. They had a son and 2 daughters, and it was one of their goals to treat them as equals and guarantee they all had access to the same educational opportunities. Hopper's mother herself was a math enthusiast. Now, obviously, this desire for knowledge and math and this goal for education rubbed off on Hopper, given the fact that she got her PhD in mathematics from Yale in her early 30s. In fact, this residential college, Calhoun College, was renamed to Hopper College around 3 years ago because, well, one person revolutionized computer science and the other is America's maybe most notorious white supremacist, so I don't know. Seems like a no-brainer to me. Um, After Hopper finished her PhD, she was a professor for a little bit for some university in New York, but she wanted to contribute to something larger, and she attempted to join the Navy, but she was deemed too skinny, old, yeah, okay, early 30s, too old, and vital to the country as a math professor. Now, she kept trying and sold her talents well, and eventually ended up working on the Harvard Mark One. The Harvard Mark One, kind of want to talk about what made the Harvard Mark One so special, just because I think that adds a lot of context about why Hopper would be so excited to work on the Mark One. The Mark One was the first true computer by today's definition of what it means to be a computer. Uh, it was fully electronic, it had no moving parts. It was entirely run by the flow of electrons. The Enigma code, which was famously cracked by Alan Turing, uh, perhaps the only computer scientist who was a household name, was done with a quote unquote computer, not actually a computer, because it had mechanical pieces. Um, Computers work in binary and they're constantly flipping circuits between on and off states. And the way Turing's machine uh, did it was through a mechanical arm actually closing and opening the circuit. And anything mechanical will break, and with so many mechanical pieces, things would break all the time. Um, and also with mechanical pieces, they can only switch between on and off states so quickly, like 40 times a second, while like modern day transistors can, I don't know, billions per second, something stupid. I mean, they're nanometers long. The technology's gotten pretty crazy. Now, in the Mark One, the big innovation in the Mark One. Now they didn't really have semiconductors yet or transistors yet. That actually comes up a little bit later in the presentation. But the innovation for the Mark One were these crystals that were discovered could be turned into diodes, which means they only allow current to flow one direction. So if you wanted to switch these crystal diodes that be in these vacuum tubes from on and off states, you just need to switch which side of the diode a charge is being applied to. So this made the number of switches per second much higher, like thousands of switches per second compared to 40. Um, didn't really resolve the issue of things breaking. Uh, I think these vacuum tubes had around a shelf life of around 10 years, and given how many there were, it was still statistically more likely that one would be broken on any given day than one not being broken. So yeah, every single day, first thing they did when they got into the office was make sure all these vacuum tubes were working. Um, this was a huge challenge for Hopper and the rest of Eichen's team, Eichen being the project head. And if you were to read the 500-page manual that Hopper wrote about the Mark One, uh, a lot of the chapters would be dedicated to maintenance of the machine, but Hopper's primary concern was with programming it. Now this would where Hopper would get her start as a programmer and begin formulating her vision of how programming would look in the future. Um, it is said that her first task on the Mark One team was to calculate the coefficients of the arctan polynomial expansion, and what so what would she do when given that task? So she would basically go to a wall of outlets and wires and switch which outlets those wires would be plugged into, and that was their way of programming the machine. Like if outlets 1 and 84, a certain subroutine would be called, and if it was outlets 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, then another subroutine would be called. Um, that's a very physical way of programming, and it's what Hopper kind of had to deal with being part of the Mark One project. And a cute story that really denotes Harper's legacy in computer science is that one day they found a dead moth. As you can see in the picture, it was apparently found in relay number 70. Um, that was messing with some of the connections of the machine. So they then debugged their machine, quite literally. And from then on out, the term debugging was created, which all computer scientists are well familiar with now. So after the Mark One, Hopper continued to work on the future marks. I think they went up to like Mark 5. I'm not really sure. I think she stopped working on them around the Mark 3. Now, the future marks enjoyed the implementation of machine language as a way of programming instead of this wall of outlets. But machine language is really unapproachable. It's just strings of zeros and ones. So instead of like plugging in outlet 10 and outlet 20, you would say 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, and then boom, the computer would know what to do. So it would be the programmer's job. It would be Hopper's job to know to have the mathematical symbolism in front of her, and then translate it to zeros and ones, which could be a very long process. So in the early 1950s, Hopper became one of the main project heads of the UNIVAC, which, if you look at the picture of the UNIVAC, so much smaller than the Mark I, even though it was just 10 years later, and that's because transistors were invented and semiconductors were discovered. Silicon Valley kind of started because silicon, of course, a semiconductor. Um, but Hopper was one of the main project heads of the UNIVAC, and thank God she was, because who knows where programming would be uh, without that position. And I'll explain why. Hopper hated programming in machine language because it seemed like a humongous barrier of entry. And this quote, I hope that the programmer may return to being a mathematician. So she was at heart a mathematician, not someone who spent all day poring through books about how to convert symbols into zeros and ones. So she kind of conceptualized this idea of a linker, which is an early form of a compiler. Now, a compiler is kind of like what is behind the mask of things like Python or MATLAB. It's the things that take if-else statements or while loops or for loops and translate it into actual machine language. Takes it from the English language, like X limits or Y limits, and puts it into zeros and ones for the way the computer could understand. A linker is not quite the compiler, because a linker, and linkers don't really exist anymore. They're kind of outdated, but they were almost entirely applied to mathematical symbolism instead of coding in English, which is what Hopper's eventual goal was. Now, the official project head of the UNIVAC told her explicitly not to do this, and it was honestly the opinion of most people in the field at the time that it would be impossible to create something like a compiler. Um, but like the idea of a linker would demand creation of even more subroutines and subroutines upon subroutines upon subroutines for you to actually be able to talk in a more basic way, because obviously you have to be abstracting stuff away if you're talking in a more basic way to the computer. So Hopper pulled the classic ask for forgiveness not permissioned and created the A0, which was the world's first linker, and you can see some pages of what it looks like. Now, of course, it's not for loops or while loops, but it's the first one, so you can't blame it. Um, this is the last slide. Don't worry, I know I'm way over time. I'll wrap it up soon. So by the A2, which was the third uh, linker that Hopper created, it was just her progress was too good to ignore. Her methods of programming, like things that we would do in numerical analysis, which is getting way too efficient and too easy to understand. And Hopper herself was a good salesman. Um, she got a team of people together to work on this thing called the Flowmatic, or the Flowmatic compiler, or the B0 compiler, which was the B representing business. And this is because the idea of compilers really started to get accepted once Hopper figured out that instead of convincing sexist, stuck in their ways peers that a compiler is useful, she could convince data analysis firms that a compiler would be profitable, because how else can you get anything done nowadays anyways? So shortly after the compiler was created, the universal language COBOL was created to use said compiler. Hopper and a team of people met up at a convention to discuss their strategy to make this language, and a year later it was basically industry standard. I even have some friends today who were taught COBOL in their business classes, and while they were quite upset they had to deal with such an old, kind of clunky language, it showcases how effective Hopper's compiler was, even though she was basically alone while developing all of the most important theory of it. It's still being used today, which is crazy, and no one really believed in her while she was doing it. All right, here are my sources. If you're curious, Hopper kind of went on. She retired from the Navy in the 70s. Um, she became a guest speaker uh, for many universities, and eventually died, like we all will one day. All right, take 4 completed. Thank you for listening.